At 9:18 in the morning on October 11th, 1943, Neel Kearby sat at 28,000 feet above the jungle coast of New Guinea, staring down at something no fighter pilot ever wanted to see, an armada. Below him, layered between 15 and 20,000 feet, the sky was crowded with Japanese aircraft, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, more than 60 by his estimate, moving across the sky like a dark river. And he had 4 airplanes. Any cautious commander in the United States Army Air Forces would have turned around immediately, radioed the base, and called for reinforcements. Kearby pushed the throttle forward and began climbing even higher. To understand why a decorated colonel would deliberately fly 4 fighters towards 60 enemy aircraft, you have to rewind to the real argument, the argument over the airplane itself. The airplane was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. From the moment Kearby arrived in the Pacific with his squadron, senior officers quietly shook their heads. According to official wisdom, the Thunderbolt simply didn't belong in this theater of war. The P-47, nicknamed the Jug because its round fuselage looked like a milk jug, was enormous for a fighter. Fully loaded, it weighed roughly 7 tons. Its huge Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp radial engine produced more than 2,000 horsepower and shook the airframe with a deep mechanical thunder. In Europe, the aircraft made perfect sense. High-altitude escort missions, long dives against ground targets, heavy armor that allowed it to absorb punishment and still bring the pilot home. But the Pacific was not Europe. The Pacific had the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero was everything the Thunderbolt was not. It weighed less than half as much. It could turn so tightly that American pilots compared fighting one to trying to swat a hummingbird with a baseball bat. It climbed quickly, maneuvered effortlessly, and because it carried almost no armor, every ounce of weight went toward agility. The Zero had ripped through Allied air forces in the early years of the war like a knife through paper. By 1943, every Pacific pilot knew the first rule of survival: never turn with a Zero. If you tried to outmaneuver it, you would lose every time. The problem was that the Thunderbolt couldn't win that kind of fight at all. So what exactly was AP-47 supposed to do in a Pacific dogfight? The experts thought they knew the answer. Not much. Twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters were better suited for the long distances of the Pacific. Navy pilots were flying Grumman F-4F Wildcat and Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters designed specifically to counter Japanese aircraft. The Thunderbolt, many officers believed, was a European machine dropped into the wrong war. Sometimes the criticism came as jokes. The Jug was a bus. The Jug was a flying safe. The Jug belonged in another ocean. Kearby heard every word of it. But instead of arguing, he spent his night studying the one thing his critics were ignoring: altitude. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was deadly at medium altitude, but it had a weakness. Its engine lacked a turbo-supercharger. As the air thinned above 20,000 feet, the Zero began to struggle. Its engine starved and its performance collapsed. The Thunderbolt was the opposite. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had a massive turbo-supercharger that compressed thin air before feeding it into the engine. The higher it climbed, the more that system showed its advantage. Above 20,000 feet, the Jug became fast, very fast. From that single fact, Kearby built a doctrine. He drilled it into his pilots with relentless discipline. Climb high, higher than feels comfortable. Stay above 20,000 feet. Pick your target from above. Roll into a dive. Build speed 400 miles per hour or more. Fire at close range. Blast through the formation before the enemy can react. Then climb again. Back to altitude. Back to safety. Never turn. Never slow down. Dive, kill, climb. Boom and zoom. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't look like the swirling dogfights in wartime newsreels. But it was brutally effective if the pilot had the discipline to follow it. Still, the skeptics remained unconvinced. A few early victories over small patrols didn't prove anything. The real test, they said, would come when Thunderbolts met a major Japanese formation, something big enough to swarm a small group of American planes from every direction. That moment arrived on October 11th, 1943. Flying with just 4 Thunderbolts, Neel Kearby reached the skies near Wewak and found exactly what the critics had been waiting for. Below him was not a patrol. It was the main event. Japanese bombers and fighters stacked in layered formations, moving out over the jungle coast, completely unaware that 4 American fighters were sitting high above them in the thin air, where the Zero's engine gasped and the Thunderbolt's engine sang. The skeptics were sitting comfortably in their briefing rooms hundreds of miles away. Neel Kearby was here, 30,000 feet above the jungle coast of New Guinea, his 7-ton fighter humming at full power, while he looked down at more than 60 Japanese aircraft and calmly decided which one to kill first. Before a single gun was fired over Wewak, Kearby had already fought the most important battle of his career, and he had fought on the ground. That battle happened months earlier inside hot canvas briefing tents, over maps and chalkboard diagrams, arguing with officers who outranked him and were absolutely certain he was wrong. It started when his squadron's Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters first arrived in the Pacific. Theater Command reacted with a mixture of polite indifference and barely hidden contempt. Kearby understood the contempt. He didn't resent it. He simply used it as fuel, because he believed something the skeptics had never properly tested, that the Thunderbolt's greatest strength had not yet been used the way it was meant to be. And until he proved it in real combat against real Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters at real altitude, he was just another pilot with an opinion. So he began with the machine itself. Before building doctrine, before drawing diagrams, before briefing a single pilot, Kearby spent weeks learning his aircraft beyond what the flight manual required. He wasn't interested in what the Thunderbolt was supposed to do in theory. He wanted to know exactly what his aircraft could do at the altitudes and conditions of the Southwest Pacific. He worked with his mechanics the way a boxer works with a trainer, pushing the equipment to find its limits, locating the narrow band where the machine performed beyond expectations and the points where performance collapsed. His crew tuned the engine for high-altitude output, adjusting the turbo-supercharger to squeeze every possible pound of thrust from a Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp above 25,000 feet. Most pilots flew their airplanes exactly as they arrived from the factory. Kearby treated it as like a custom tool. What he discovered during those early tests confirmed everything he had argued. At low altitude, the Thunderbolt was exactly what critics said it was: a heavy, sluggish machine that a Zero could outturn without effort. But above 20,000 feet, the entire equation reversed. The Zero had no turbocharger to compensate for thin air. As altitude increased, its engine lost power, its climb rate dropped, its top speed fell away, and the razor-sharp maneuverability that made it deadly at 15,000 feet became dull and ordinary at 25,000. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, was finally in its natural environment. Its turbo-supercharger fed compressed air into the engine regardless of altitude, keeping power strong where the Zero was already struggling to breathe. And when a Thunderbolt began to dive from that height, when a 7-ton fighter pointed its nose straight down and let gravity join the engine, the physics became brutal. A heavy object falling from high altitude accelerates faster than anything starting below it can catch. In a full-power dive from 28,000 feet, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could reach speeds that left pursuing Zeros hopelessly behind. Kearby built his entire combat doctrine around that single fact. He called it altitude discipline. The rules were absolute. You climb before engaging. Always. You never dropped to the enemy's level to begin a fight. You avoided combat below 20,000 feet whenever possible. You selected your target from above, rolled into a dive, and built speed on the way down. By the time you reached firing range, you were moving so fast that the Japanese pilot had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds to react before 8.50 caliber machine guns ended the conversation permanently. Then you pulled out of the dive, pointed the nose back toward the sky, and climbed again. You climbed even when your instinct screamed to turn around for another shot. You climbed even when you thought you could finish the fight. Because the moment you slowed down and began circling, you were no longer fighting a Thunderbolt battle. You were fighting a Zero battle. And in a Zero battle, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero almost always won. Kearby drilled this discipline into his pilots through endless repetition. They practiced mock engagements above the jungle, while he played the attacker, and his wingmen practiced resisting the instinct to chase targets they had already passed. Pilots raised on more agile fighters had to unlearn their instincts. In aircraft like the Supermarine Spitfire or the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, agility was your safety net. If you got into trouble, you turned harder and fought your way out. In the Thunderbolt, turning harder was how you died. Your real safety net was altitude and speed, and the moment you spent either one carelessly, you were suddenly exposed in the worst possible way. Slow, low, and surrounded by aircraft that were built for exactly that situation. That was the nightmare Neel Kearby had designed his entire doctrine to avoid. The first real test of that doctrine came over Wewak in the weeks before October 11th, when he led a flight of Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters against a Japanese patrol and brought down 4 enemy aircraft without losing a single plane. The tactic worked exactly as he had designed it. The Japanese pilots never had time to organize a response because the attack was finished before they fully understood what was happening. For Thunderbolt appeared from high altitude at enormous speed, tore through formation like a freight train through a cardboard wall, and climbed away again before the surviving Mitsubishi A6M Zero pilots could even reverse their turns to pursue. For kills, no losses. By any combat standard, it was a success. But to Theater Command, it was only promising data. Something interesting, perhaps, but not enough yet to change their overall opinion about the Thunderbolt's place in the Pacific War. Kearby understood that. If they wanted data, he knew exactly where to get it. Allied reconnaissance had been studying Wewak for months, and what those reports showed was unsettling. Wewak was not a small forward outpost. It was a central hub of Japanese air power in the entire New Guinea campaign, a sprawling network of airstrips on the northern coast where Japan staged aircraft for operations across the Southwest Pacific. Intelligence photographs suggested that between 100 and 150 aircraft operated from Wewak at any given time. Fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance planes, moving in and out of the base almost continuously. George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force under Douglas MacArthur, understood that Wewak had to be neutralized if the Allied campaign in New Guinea was going to move forward. You could not push an army up the coast while more than 100 Japanese aircraft sat behind you with the freedom to attack your supply lines whenever they wished. Kearby volunteered to lead a reconnaissance in force, a small, fast flight that would approach the base, assess Japanese activity, attack targets of opportunity, and leave before the defenders could organize a full response. The size of the force he proposed raised eyebrows immediately. For aircraft, for Thunderbolts flying straight toward the most heavily defended Japanese air base in the Southwest Pacific, staff officers responded with the same careful language he had heard for months. It was polite, professional, and deeply skeptical. For planes against Wewak was not reconnaissance. It was a funeral procession. Kearby went anyway. On the morning of October 11, 1943, he led 3 wingmen north toward the coast, climbing the entire way. The Thunderbolts passed 20,000 feet, then continued upward to 28,000, where the air was thin, cold, and perfect for the aircraft's turbo-supercharged engine. When Wewak finally appeared below him and the scale of the Japanese formation became clear, there was no hesitation, no radio call back to base, no reconsideration of the plan. Kearby looked down at the mass of aircraft filling the sky and felt exactly what his doctrine had been designed to create. Absolute confidence. The confidence of a pilot who knew precisely what his machine could do, who had rehearsed this moment in his head dozens of times, and who understood that the only direction that mattered now was straight down. He rolled the Thunderbolt inverted and pushed the nose toward the formation. The moment the aircraft tipped into its dive, physics took over in a way no argument could dispute. A 7-ton fighter powered by a 2,000-horsepower engine diving from 28,000 feet does not simply descend. It commits. Speed built instantly. The airspeed indicator swept past 300 miles per hour before Kearby had fully selected his first target. By the time he reached firing distance, he was traveling well over 400 miles per hour, giving the pilot below him about as much time to react as someone standing under a falling safe. His first target was a Mitsubishi P-46 reconnaissance aircraft, known to Allied pilots by the reporting name Dina. The sleek twin-engine plane was designed for speed and range rather than combat, and was already operating near the upper edge of its comfortable altitude. Its crew never saw the Thunderbolt coming. The sky above their aircraft appeared empty because no one expected an attack from 28,000 feet over their own airfield. Kearby closed the distance in seconds. He fired his 8.50 caliber machine guns from such close range that missing would have been difficult. The Mitsubishi P-47 disintegrated instantly, tearing apart like a fragile model struck by a hammer. Pieces scattered in every direction as the wreckage began to fall toward the jungle. Kearby was already pulling up and climbing again before the debris had time to drop 1,000 feet. Kill number 1 had taken only seconds from the beginning of the dive. That speed was the entire point. The Japanese formation around him was enormous. Bombers and fighters stacked across thousands of feet of vertical airspace. In the first seconds after his attack, their reaction was exactly what he had predicted. Confusion. Not panic yet. Just a brief cognitive delay that occurs when trained pilots try to understand an attack that arrives from an unexpected direction at impossible speed. That delay was the opening. Kearby used it immediately. The Thunderbolt climbed hard back toward altitude, the turbo-supercharger feeding power into the engine even in the thin air, and before he completed the climb, he had already selected the next target. A Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter had spotted the destruction and was clawing upward, try to gain altitude to intercept. At low altitude, the Zero's climb rate was legendary. But up here, above 20,000 feet, the aircraft's engine was already struggling for breath, and it was climbing straight into the hunting ground Kearby had chosen. The Zero's engine was soft, the climb labored, and the altitude it was reaching for was still below where Neel Kearby already was. He didn't wait. He rolled again, built speed in the dive, and struck the climbing Mitsubishi A6M Zero, while it was still slow and committed to climb it could not change quickly enough. 8.50 caliber machine guns fired at close range, and the lightest, most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific turned into a fireball that fell away from the sky like a dropped torch. Kill number 2. The pattern was becoming visible to anyone watching from above, but watching from above was exactly where nobody else was. Kearby's 3 wingmen were working their own targets at slightly lower altitudes, following the same doctrine. Dive, fire, climb, never circle, never surrender the altitude advantage that made the whole tactic work. The Japanese formation was large enough that many of its pilots were only now realizing they were under coordinated attack. This was not a stray aircraft wandering into their airspace. It was a deliberate assault from a small group of Americans who had been sitting above them long enough to choose their targets carefully. Kearby's third pass targeted a Mitsubishi G4M bomber. The long-range naval aircraft Allied crews had nicknamed Betty. The plane carried enormous fuel loads and tanks that ran through its wings without the self-sealing protection common in American designs. Allied pilots had discovered early in the war that a short burst of heavy machine gun fire into those wings could ignite the entire aircraft. Kearby dove from above and behind where the tail gunner's field of fire was narrowest and the wing roots were exposed. He held the trigger down to the firing pass with calm, deliberate timing. The Betty's left wing ignited from root to tip. The bomber rolled over and plunged downward, trailing a thick column of black smoke visible for miles. Kill number 3. By now the Japanese formation had changed completely. Instead of an organized flight, it resembled a disturbed anthill, aircraft turning in different directions, pilots searching the sky for attackers that kept appearing from above. Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters broke away from their escorts and tried to climb toward the threat, but they were chasing an altitude they could barely reach before the next American pass had already ended. From his position high above, Kearby watched the chaos with the calm clarity of a pilot who prepared for exactly the situation. And then he saw something that mattered more than another kill. One of his wingmen had drifted lower than he should have been. A Zero had slipped in behind him and was closing fast. Kearby reacted instantly. There was no time for calculation. He rolled into a steep dive and dropped between the 2 aircraft with enormous speed. The Japanese pilot suddenly faced a brutal choice: break off the attack or be destroyed. The decision was made for him before he could fully understand it. Kearby fired at point-blank range, and the Zero disintegrated under the hammering .50 caliber fire. Fragments of the destroyed fighter rattled across the thick aluminum skin of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt as he flew straight through the debris. Kill number 4. The wingman climbed away, unaware of how close the margin had been. Now the signals began coming in from the rest of the flight. Ammunition running low, fuel levels dropping. The quiet arithmetic of combat logistics was beginning to assert itself. The rational decision was obvious. Climb, regroup, and return to base with 4 kills and every pilot alive. By any standard, that was already a successful mission. Kearby acknowledged the signals and started to climb. Then he saw the 5th target, and the 6th. For months he had drilled iron discipline into his pilots. Attack once, climb, never get greedy. But now he could see the situation clearly. The altitude was still his, the Japanese formation was still disorganized, and his Thunderbolt still carried enough ammunition for 2 more passes. The window was still open. The 5th kill was another Mitsubishi A6M Zero, caught at the wrong altitude at exactly the wrong moment, and destroyed with a kind of efficiency that had become almost mechanical during the engagement. The 6th target was harder. Neel Kearby was lower now, deeper in the altitude band where the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was more capable. He had less energy stored in his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and far less margin for error on the pullout. He committed anyway. The 8.50 caliber guns tore through the target at extremely close range, distances the Thunderbolt's designers had probably never specifically imagined. Kearby pulled out a dive with altitude closing around him, climbing almost vertically on full emergency power. The engine pushed beyond anything the manual considered comfortable. The Zeros that tried to follow lasted about 30 seconds before the thin air strangled their engines, and they fell away below, unable to climb where Kearby was already flying. He leveled off above 25,000 feet, turned south toward home, and began the long flight back from Wewak with 6 confirmed kills, minimal fuel, several fresh holes in the airframe, and gun cameras that had recorded every second of the engagement. He landed at Dobodura Airfield with the Thunderbolt battered enough that the ground crews went pale when they inspected it. The mechanics who swarmed the aircraft did not celebrate immediately. They counted holes, checked hydraulic lines, and inspected the engine for stress fractures, the mechanical equivalent of the damage a hard sprint leaves in a runner's knees. The Thunderbolt had taken the punishment and brought its pilot home exactly as it had been designed to do. The debrief was when the number became real for the people who had not been in the sky to see it. Kearby walked into the intelligence tent and began reconstructing the engagement step by step. Altitude of contact, number of Japanese aircraft, attack sequence, observed results. As the officers wrote, the reaction in the room slowly changed. They began asking him to slow down, repeating details, cross-checking his account with the reports from his wingmen. The arithmetic kept producing the same conclusion. 6 confirmed kills in a single engagement for American fighters attacking one of the most heavily defended air bases in the Southwest Pacific, and not a single Thunderbolt lost. The intelligence officers requested the gun camera film before the debrief had even finished. The footage settled the matter completely. Frame by frame, it showed exactly what Kearby's doctrine looked like when executed perfectly. The dives from altitude, the high-speed firing passes, the rapid climbs before the Japanese pilots could respond. 6 aircraft destroyed in a sequence so methodical that it looked less like a chaotic dogfight and more like a demonstration. The skeptics who had spent months arguing that the Thunderbolt was a wrong aircraft for the Pacific Theater suddenly found their position impossible to defend. The evidence on the screen had destroyed the argument as thoroughly as Kearby had destroyed the aircraft over Wewak. George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, understood immediately what the footage meant, not just for Kearby but for the entire Pacific Air Campaign. He forwarded the recommendation for the Medal of Honor with unusual speed. Douglas MacArthur personally presented the award to Kearby, citing the action of October 11, 1943, the mission that many officers had doubted when it was proposed but could not ignore once it was completed. The award changed the conversation about the Thunderbolt in the Pacific in a way months of tactical arguments had never managed to do. A Medal of Honor backed by gun camera footage was a more persuasive document than any briefing paper. The 5th Air Force began integrating Kearby's altitude discipline doctrine into formal training, and pilots across the theater started flying a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt the way he had proven it should be flown: fast, high, and always with gravity on their side. The heavy, round-nosed machine that had once been mocked as a flying bus, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, suddenly carried a different reputation. The aircraft that critics had called too heavy for the Pacific had just produced the most dramatic single-mission kill count of the Pacific Air War to that point, and the pilots who flew it began to carry themselves differently because of it. Neel Kearby kept flying. That part of his story carries particular weight, because the vindication he had earned began to work against him in ways he probably understood but could not completely avoid. By early 1944, he had 22 confirmed aerial victories, placing him among the leading American aces of the entire war. Everyone around him knew another number as well, the First World War record of 26 victories held by Eddie Rickenbacker. That number quietly sat in every mission briefing like an extra piece of equipment nobody had officially issued, but everyone could see. The same drive that had pushed Kearby to challenge skeptical commanders, build a doctrine from scratch, and fly 4 fighters into a sky crowded with enemies was now pushing him toward a record. But a drive without limits eventually places even the best pilot in situations where skill alone cannot compensate. On March 5, 1944, Kearby flew again over Wewak, the same sky where he had proven everything he needed to prove. This time the engagement unfolded in ways his doctrine had always been designed to avoid. His altitude advantage was gone. The numbers were against him. The margin of speed and height that had always protected him simply was not there. He was shot down over the jungles of New Guinea. He was 32 years old. The war would continue another year and a half without him. What he left behind was far more than a personal record. The tactical framework he had built around the strengths of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt became a foundation of doctrine for the 5th Air Force for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The Thunderbolt would go on to fly more than 700,000 combat sorties across every theater of World War II. In the Pacific especially, many pilots flew it exactly the way Kearby had demonstrated, from altitude at speed. Striking hard and climbing away before the fight could turn into the kind of close maneuvering battle where the Mitsubishi A6M Zero excelled. The men who came after him fought differently because of what he showed them. Those who survived the war carried his approach into every engagement they flew afterward. Today, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt hangs in museums as a monument to brute force. 7 tons of aluminum and steel, 8 heavy machine guns, and a 2,000 horsepower engine, the largest single-engine fighter the United States built during the war. Visitors walk around it and see a machine designed to absorb punishment and deliver it in equal measure, a symbol of American industrial power at its wartime peak. What they do not see is the argument that came before it. The months of skepticism and quiet mockery that one determined fighter pilot absorbed before answering those doubts with gun camera footage and a Medal of Honor citation. They do not see the doctrine built inside a humid briefing tent, or the discipline drilled into pilots who had to unlearn their instincts about turning fights. They do not see the 4 aircraft that flew north toward 60 enemies and came home with 6 kills and no losses. Stories like this are worth rescuing from silence, because the people who change the way wars are fought rarely do it with permission from the authorities who believe they already know the answers. And the ones who endure the skepticism long enough to prove those answers wrong deserve to be remembered by name,